The sound of a distant engine echoes through the metal walls. The air smells of oil, iron, and hope. It's the dawn of March 17th, 1943, and the floor of the Willow Run factory in Michigan vibrates like the heart of a nation in motion. Outside, it's still night, but thousands of workers are already at their posts. Men in grease-stained overalls, women with colorful scarves tied around their hair and determination in their eyes. The noise is deafening, hammers pounding, cranes moving, engines being tested. Yet there's a hidden harmony in that chaos, the sound of freedom being built piece by piece. The war is in full swing. In Europe, the German army seems unstoppable. France is occupied. The Soviet Union bleeds on the Eastern Front, and bombs rain down on London night after night. But here on American soil, something is rising that will change the course of history. The industrial might of the United States. Franklin D. Roosevelt had promised to turn the nation into the arsenal of democracy. And what he promised, the people made real. Automobile factories became tank factories. Assembly lines that once produced family cars now gave birth to B-24 Liberator bombers. Giant metal beasts with 4 engines, capable of crossing oceans and carrying destruction to the heart of the enemy. Every rivet placed, every weld made, every engine tested represented a silent act of patriotism. The workers weren't just producing machines. They were shaping the destiny of freedom. Women, once confined to domestic chores, became the backbone of the war effort. With steady hands and resolute eyes, they filled the places of the men who had gone off to fight. They were called Rosies, in honor of the symbol Rosie the Riveter, and they became icons of a generation. They operated cranes, welded fuselages, tightened bolts with surgical precision. Their simple clothes and patterned scarves hid something monumental, the courage of those who knew they were holding up the world. American factories never slept. They ran 24 hours a day, divided into 3 shifts. When one worker left, another arrived. Production never stopped. Every sound of the machines was a reminder that even thousands of miles away from the front, the American people were fighting with the tools they had. And they were winning. Willow Run became a living legend. It was the largest factory in the world under a single roof, a building spanning 1.6 million square meters, where airplanes were born every 63 minutes. Imagine that. Every hour, a new B-24 bomber rolled off the assembly line, ready to take flight. The workers said proudly, "We don't build planes, we build victory." From above, the sight was breathtaking. Hundreds of aircraft lined up, their silver wings reflecting the morning sun, ready to soar into the sky. The roar of engines, the smell of fuel, and the gleam of metal formed an industrial symphony that echoed hope. Inside, no one spoke of quitting. No one complained about the long hours or the modest pay, because everyone knew that what was at stake was greater than any personal sacrifice. It was the fate of civilization itself. In the cafeteria, men and women ate in silence, exhausted but proud. They knew that every drop of sweat brought them closer to the end of tyranny. And across the ocean, the enemies were beginning to realize it. There were no satellites, but rumors spread fast. German ships reported American planes in ever-growing numbers. Infiltrated agents sent coded messages. The Americans are producing the unimaginable. The truth is that on that day, March 17, 1943, without even realizing it, the workers of Willow Run had already won a battle that hadn't yet begun. Not on the battlefield, but in the foundations of steel and courage. When the shift ended and the sirens wailed, the last sound of the day was that of an engine roaring to life, a B-24 rolling down the runway toward the sky. In the metallic reflection of its fuselage, the sunrise painted the colors of American victory. The sun had barely risen when a freight train stopped quietly on the outskirts of Ypsilanti, Michigan. Among the workers, stepping down from the wagons, two men watched the horizon with unusual attention. One of them, wearing a wrinkled grey suit and a worn-out hat, pretended to be a railroad engineer. The other, speaking with a foreign accent and carrying a small notebook hidden inside his coat pocket, was a spy for the Third Reich. His real name was Klaus Richter, but here he went by Karl. He had a simple, yet dangerous, mission: to confirm the rumors that the United States had built a factory capable of producing bombers on a scale the world had never seen. If it were true, Germany was doomed. Richter and his partner walked along the fences, still covered in melting snow, until they reached a hill from where they could see the Willow Run factory. What they saw there left them speechless. A sea of metal and movement. An endless expanse of hangars, cranes, trucks and assembly lines stretching as far as the eye could see. Thousands of workers moved in and out like ants in perfect coordination. Even from a distance, the sound of machinery was deafening. Pneumatic hammers, engines being tested, shouted commands, the sharp crack of rivets being driven into steel. Richter adjusted his binoculars. The sunlight reflecting off the metal nearly blinded him. Then he saw something that froze his blood. Hundreds of B-24 Liberator bombers lined up, ready to fly. Their wings gleamed like swords under the golden morning light. Each one bore the proud white star of the U.S. Army Air Forces painted on its side. He counted 1, 2, 10, then gave up. There were too many. Hundreds, maybe more. And new aircraft kept rolling out from inside the hangars, pushed by men and women covered in grease. Each machine looked alive, breathing power. The wind carried the scent of fuel and hot metal. Klaus closed his notebook. There was no need to write anything more. What he was witnessing changed everything. As he watched, one bomber began to move. Its engines roared, blowing dust and dry leaves across the ground. The sound made Richter instinctively step back. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, followed by another and another. 3, 4, 5 steel giants took to the air in perfect sequence. The Michigan sky trembled. It was like watching a winged army being born before his eyes. "My God," he murmured in German, "this is impossible." His partner, pale, replied softly, "If this is only one factory, then the war is already over." But Richter didn't answer. He just kept staring, transfixed. That factory wasn't merely a military installation. It was a symbol of a nation that believed in freedom with the same fervor that the Reich believed in domination. That night, in a small hotel room in Detroit, he wrote a coded report to Berlin. It read, "The Americans have built a bomber production line of unimaginable scale. The factory known as Willow Run manufactures aircraft at an industrial pace. I estimate that within a year they will have total air supremacy. If our enemies maintain this rhythm, Germany cannot win this war." The message was intercepted days later by British intelligence, which quickly shared it with the American OSS. When the document reached Washington, officials smiled quietly. The information meant to alarm the Nazis only confirmed what President Roosevelt already knew. Victory would not be decided on the battlefields of Europe, but in the factories of the United States. Back in his room, Klaus Richter stubbed out his cigarette and stared out the window. In the darkness, he could see the distant glow of the hangars, lights blinking endlessly. Production never stopped, not even for a minute. He knew he was witnessing the end of Hitler's dream, and it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The next morning, before leaving, he heard the engines roaring again. He looked up at the sky. The sun reflected on the wings of the bombers slicing through the clouds, and for a brief, silent moment he was certain of one thing: freedom had already won. The sun had not yet risen on the horizon when the factory whistle roared like thunder. The sound spread through the streets of Ypsilanti, blending with the cold morning wind. Simple houses trembled, and windows lit up one by one. It was the daily call. The call of war, answered not with weapons but with tools. On the sidewalks, women with red scarves tied around their hair walked briskly. They carried aluminum lunchboxes, leather gloves, and determined eyes. Their names were Mary, Helen, Louise, but the entire country called them Rosie, after the icon that appeared on posters bearing the motto, "We can do it." And they could. Inside the factory, the atmosphere was an orchestra of metallic sounds. Pneumatic hammers, the crack of rivets, engines being tested. The air was thick, smelling of grease and sweat, yet there was something sacred about it. Every motion, every gesture was part of an invisible choreography, the ballet of production in the name of freedom. Mary, a 26-year-old whose husband was fighting in North Africa, welded the metal joints of a bomber. Her hands trembled at first, but over time they became as steady as the wings she built. In silence, she thought of him, and of how one of these very planes might protect him. Helen, older and widowed by a veteran of the First World War, was a supervisor on the assembly line. No one dared question her authority. When a rivet wasn't perfect, she would stare firmly and say, "Do it again. This plane will save lives." Among them were 18-year-old boys and men over 50, working side by side. Farmers, mechanics, students. Some had never seen an airplane up close before, and now they were building them. In the cafeteria, conversations were brief, the clatter of spoons against metal lunchboxes mixed with tired voices. They talked about sons at war, about letters that took too long to arrive, about radio reports announcing victories and defeats. But above all, they talked about hope. Outside the factory, life had changed as well. The streets were covered with posters urging rationing. Buy carefully, save gasoline. Every piece of rubber counts. Children collected scrap metal on sidewalks, and even churches held drives to donate copper and aluminum. The entire nation breathed the same purpose. There was pride in every face. People knew they were building something far greater than airplanes. They were building the future. The war had taken millions far from home, but it had united an entire people under a single ideal: the defense of freedom. At the end of her shift, Mary wiped the grease from her hands and looked at the newly finished bomber. The fuselage gleamed under the industrial lights. She rested her fingers on the cold metal and whispered, "Fly safe and bring our boys back." Across the ocean, those planes would cross hostile skies, face flak and enemy fighters, yet each carried within it the invisible touch of millions of Americans who believed in a better world. The newspapers began to print astonishing headlines. Willow Run delivers 500 bombers per month. Ford breaks production record. But what the headlines didn't show was what truly powered that machinery: faith, courage, and sacrifice. Even without weapons in their hands, these people were soldiers. Soldiers of the home front, soldiers of production, soldiers of hope. And while in Europe, tanks roared and the skies filled with smoke, here on the assembly lines, another kind of war was being won. A war of endurance, of perseverance, of pure human will. In that March of 1943, every American worker, man, woman, young or old, became part of the beating heart that would keep the flame of democracy alive. And the world began to realize that the United States was not merely a country. It was an idea in motion, an idea that said, freedom is worth every drop of sweat. It was a cold March night in 1943, in Berlin. Inside the grey building of the Abwehr, the Third Reich's intelligence service, a messenger hurried down the corridors, clutching an envelope sealed with a red wax mark of utmost priority. The sound of boots echoed against the marble floor as officers in immaculate uniforms glanced up curiously. There was something different about this report, something urgent. The document had come from the United States. The author was one of Germany's best agents, embedded in America, Klaus Richter. He had risked his life to write it. Yet its contents were not what the Germans expected. At the top of the first page, in crisp letters, it read, "Report number 7, Willow Run, Michigan." The officer in charge, Colonel Franz Keller, opened the envelope with trembling hands. The pages were covered in precise notes, numbers, diagrams, observations about workers, schedules, factory dimensions. But it was the first paragraph that froze his blood. Confirmed, the Willow Run factory is real. It produces B-24 bombers on an industrial scale. One completed aircraft every 63 minutes. I estimate over 500 units per month. Conclusion: the United States has reached total war capacity. Keller turned pale. He reread the lines several times in disbelief. Then, without a word, he carried the document to the German High Command headquarters. There, the report was delivered to Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, and shortly afterward to Adolf Hitler's own desk. As the document passed from hand to hand among officers, the distant roar of Allied bombers could already be heard over Europe's cities. The contrast was striking. On one side, the arrogance of the Reich, convinced of its invincibility. On the other, the rise of an American industrial machine that defied all limits. The next morning, inside the command bunker in Rastenburg, Hitler received the report. The room was utterly silent. He began to read, his eyes moving rigidly across each line. When he reached the conclusion, he slammed his fist against the table. The metallic echo reverberated through the narrow walls. "Lies!" he shouted. "American propaganda!" But Speer, standing beside him, replied in a low, grave voice, "Mein Führer, if this is true, we are facing something we cannot match." Hitler turned slowly. His face, once flushed with anger, grew pale. He knew exactly what it meant. The war he believed he commanded had slipped from his hands. That same night, a secret meeting was called. Generals and strategists debated how to respond. Some proposed sabotaging American factories, others suggested intensifying espionage. But deep down, everyone knew it was too late. The Willow Run report was an involuntary confession that Germany had lost the industrial race. While the Germans argued beneath the streets of Berlin, across the Atlantic, the sound of machinery never ceased. In Michigan, men and women kept working in silence, unaware of the impact they were having on the enemy's heart. In the weeks that followed, the report continued to circulate between offices and high-security vaults. One copy was intercepted by the British, who forwarded it to the OSS, the American Intelligence Service. When the document reached Washington, it was received with a mix of pride and solemnity. A handwritten note appeared in the margin from an OSS officer. "Now they know what we have always known, that the American people are the most powerful weapon in the world." In the months that followed, Richter's predictions came true. The number of American bombers over Europe's skies increased exponentially. Nazi factories began to fall one after another. German soldiers' morale crumbled. In Berlin, Klaus Richter was declared missing. Some said he tried to escape, others whispered he was executed for bringing bad news. No one knew for sure, but what he had written survived and became the symbol of an undeniable truth. Freedom builds more than tyranny can destroy. And so, the report that was meant to help the Reich ultimately sealed its fate. That piece of paper, which crossed oceans and bunkers, became an early epitaph for an empire that believed itself eternal. The sound was like distant thunder, growing, vibrating, filling the air with power. Men in the trenches of Europe looked up, hands shielding their eyes from the sun, trying to count the number of aircraft above. But it was impossible. The entire sky was covered with American bombers, a silver swarm shimmering in the cold morning light. Each one was a B-24 Liberator, born in the factories of Michigan, assembled by calloused hands and hearts full of faith. The engines roared like a metallic prayer. That sound, deep, rhythmic and relentless, was the new hymn of freedom. Down below, in the occupied cities, French and Polish civilians stopped in the streets and gazed upward. Some wept, others made the sign of the cross. The sound of those engines was more than the noise of war. It was the sound of hope returning home. In London, a British journalist wrote, "When American bombers cross the sky, it is as if the sun itself has returned to shine upon Europe." The pilots were young, men in their 20s with shy smiles and boundless courage. Many had learned to fly only months before, and now they commanded 25-ton machines over enemy territory, facing clouds of anti-aircraft fire. Inside the cockpits, the air was cold, faces slick with sweat and oil, eyes fixed on the instruments. Each mission could be their last, but no one hesitated. American power had become visible, audible, undeniable. The skies belonged to America. As the bombers flew toward Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich, the factories back home never stopped. It was a synchronized dance. When one plane took off over Europe, another was being assembled in Michigan. The entire country breathed in engine rhythm. On the radio, Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke with calm conviction. "They may destroy our ships, but they will never destroy what drives us, the belief in freedom and in the dignity of man." And the people believed him. In schools, children drew airplanes and wrote letters to soldiers they would never meet. In churches, pastors and priests prayed for the crews flying through the heavens. On farms, families heard the distant rumble of engines on quiet nights and said, "That's the sound of victory coming." By 1944, when Allied troops prepared to land in Normandy, it was air dominance that made the impossible possible. Every advance on the ground depended on the American air fleet. On planes built in places like Willow Run, flown by young men who believed in something greater than themselves, the bombers flew in tight formation like an army of metallic angels. The sunlight reflecting off their wings created an almost sacred spectacle. It was as if the very heavens had surrendered to the cause of freedom. On the other side, the Germans watched helplessly. The sirens wailed, too late. The Reich's factories were being destroyed one by one. The empire that once prided itself on its war machine now trembled before an enemy that fought not just with weapons, but with purpose. When the first liberated Allied prisoners returned from Europe, they all said the same thing. The day we heard the engines of the B-24s was the day we knew we were saved. And so, what began as a promise in speeches and assembly lines became a spectacle of faith, steel, and courage. By the end of the war, more than 18,000 B-24 liberators had been built. No empire in history had produced so much, so fast, with such precision and such heart. Every plane carried a story. A welder, a mechanic, a farmer, a pilot. Each was a link in a human chain that stretched across oceans and generations. When the war ended, the sound of the engines finally stopped. But for those who lived through that time, the sound never truly faded. It echoed in memory as both remembrance and warning. Freedom must be built every day with work, courage, and faith. The engines fell silent. The factories, once alive like beating hearts, grew quiet. But something remained, an echo that endures to this day. In the grease-stained hands of the workers, in the tired eyes of the women with red scarves, in the reports that terrified tyrants, and in the silver wings that crossed the Atlantic, there was born a truth that time cannot erase. Freedom triumphs when the people believe in it. Willow Run was more than a factory. It was a promise that America would never bow to fear, that the ordinary courage of men and women could change the course of history. The planes that soared over Europe carried more than bombs. They carried hope. Every B-24 was a message written in metal. Democracy lives, tyranny falls. And when the war ended, the world looked to the United States and saw something greater than power. It saw character. Because the strength of a nation is not measured by its weapons, but by its values. And on that March 17, 1943, when the first bomber was born from American sweat and faith, the world learned what it truly means to fight for freedom, not for conquest, but for conviction. Today, decades later, the sound of those engines still echoes in the skies of history, not as the noise of war, but as a hymn of faith, of labor, and of unity. And so this story ends. The day the skies spoke American,